Hello and welcome to the Accelerated Savings in-year Delivery webinar. My name is Sushank Agarwal. I'm a senior principal within Efficio. I've got over 20 years of experience helping clients driving tangible cost benefits. I work across different sectors ranging from financial services, infrastructure, retail, oil and gas, and telco, as you can see on my career trajectory on this page. Over the last few years, there's a number of clients where I've supported and ran rapid benefits delivery programs, and which are more focused on in-year savings delivery. And this seems to be a increasingly common theme that we're seeing across a number of specific sectors at the moment. So as part of this webinar, what I'd like to do is to share some learnings, and we've refined our approach based on those learnings, just hopefully help you generate some ideas on how you can go about driving in-year benefits in your organizations. So before I start, I'll give you a quick heads up in terms of who we are. As Efficio, we are the largest procurement consultancy firm across the globe. A lot of our work is happening in Europe and UK, North America, Middle East, which are the strongest hubs with local offices. We've got over 500 consultants, so a large pool of resource who represent 40 different nationalities. The majority of we work across the majority of industries, sectors, including private equity clients, where a lot of our work comes in, and there's a need for tangible benefits delivery in those sectors as well. What differentiates us from our competition is typically our hands-on attitudes to really get the work done. So we're not only steering our clients, we're also running alongside them until the job's done. And in order to do that, we leverage our technology platform, eFlow, which makes it easier, faster, and delivers higher benefits typically as we go through. So moving on in terms of the session that we've got today, there's 4 key aspects that I'd like to get out of the session. Now, hopefully at the end of the session, you will have greater insight on those 4 aspects. The first thing is what's the benefit that you can typically expect from this approach that will be delivered to your organizations from an in-year benefits perspective, which is typically, as we'll go into the detail, is very different to a typical approach. So what's our view in terms of typical benefits that you can maximize? Secondly, what are the core levers and approaches? These are the tried and tested approaches that we've deployed across different clients in different sectors, and we've incorporated our learnings as well. So I'll share some insights on what those typical levers are, and also what works well and what are the pitfalls to avoid. Number 3, bringing a couple of real life examples so that we can demonstrate to you in terms of how other organizations have done this in the past and what benefits have they realized by driving these approaches. And finally, just summarizing the key success factors. There are certain aspects which are absolutely critical for your organization to have before you embark this journey. Because it's a very different approach to a typical sourcing approach. So the first aspect, which is essentially what can you expect to achieve from a savings perspective by deploying this approach? In our experience, there's typically, out of your total addressable spend or total spend, there's about 2/3 of the spend that can be addressed from an in-year savings delivery perspective in some shape or form. The remaining 1/3 we typically see as very difficult or very hard to address from an in-year savings delivery approach. And there might be areas typically within that 1/3 which where you've got suppliers who are engaged on business critical activities such as some regulatory programs that are running which you don't want to disturb from a INEA benefits perspective, or there might be some contracts that have recently negotiated and there's some large penalties involved in terms of moving away from those contracts. Or there could be some large capex programs, IT capex programs coming to an end over the year. So typically, I think if you discount those type of that spend, there's about 2/3, which if you've got a total spend of about $1 billion, we account for just under 670 million or so that you can address, and you can drive some benefits in some shape or form. Out of that 2/3, what we see is there's three key approaches, that group of approaches, a group of activities that deliver benefits. The first one, which is around supply related, that you see on the top right corner of the screen, which is essentially typically negotiating with the current suppliers. This typically, when we go into our clients, is an approach where the clients have already tried and tested, and it's typically the most popular one with most of the organizations, where the organizations will go out for a standard discount because the business is in distress and they need to drive some savings really fast within the next few weeks or months, and they'll ask for a blanket discount across the suppliers. Again, a hit and miss approach, but it typically yields the lowest. But there's a misconception that this approach always needs to be a tactical approach. There are certain strategic aspects of this approach, which I'll talk you through in the rest of the podcast. So that's number one. The second one is around demand-related activities, and these are what can you do to drive or optimize your requirements and challenge back on over-engineered SLAs or specifications that you've got. And as you can see, this is the largest benefit that the organizations typically achieve. Organizations who strategically look at that and look at their key requirements and drive that. This is typically the lost opportunity where majority of the organizations completely miss out because they're so focused on the supply related savings approaches. And then finally, there's the purchasing desk, or in some organizations, it's also called the cost control tower, which is essentially putting a governance in place, and you're choking demand right up front. And this is to drive not only from a EBITDA perspective, but also cash flow perspective. What can you stop and what can you delay is essentially that this governance is trying to do. So a combination of those three approaches is typically what we expect to yield a 3 to 5% benefit, which if you apply those numbers to a 667 million spend, which is the 2/3 that's addressable, that's typically 20 to 34 million that you can expect to achieve from this approach. So the next question is, what do you need to do to deliver these benefits? And in our view, as I mentioned before, there's three key group of levers. And what you see here is almost a grid of benefit, how much you can achieve from a INEA savings perspective. And on the x-axis, you see the aggressiveness. So how disruptive do you want to be? And this all depends upon the various factors, which I'll talk you through at the last in terms of critical success factors. But there are organizations who are in desperate need for plugging the INEA savings gap. And they've got the CEO's sponsorship to drive it forward. And they go through a highly aggressive route in terms of delivering that. Again, there's pros and cons, but you need that sponsorship to drive that 4 to 7% of the savings, versus organizations who are almost there from a INEA savings target perspective. However, there is a gap and they haven't got that level of sponsorship, but they need to do something about it, which is the less disruptive end of the scale. So I'll talk you through the two areas, and maybe we'll project some ideas on what you can do, but across those three group of levers or approaches that we've got. So the first one is around demand related. So this is, broadly speaking, how can you challenge or optimize demand that you've got incoming? And it's essentially opening up the details of your key contracts or your key requirements. looking at the service level agreements with some of your facilities management providers or IT services contracts, or it could be looking at certain specifications on your hardware, which is enterprise hardware or end user hardware within the IT side, or it could be the marketing service levels that you've got with your media agencies and creative agencies in terms of what you're achieving. So the idea there is to almost start doing a zero-based bottom-up in terms of the specifications and the SLAs, and trying to get to a level where you reach to a minimum expected level from a service levels or specifications that is fit for the organization. Because if you drop below that, then the service is not fit for purpose. So what you then tend to do is working together with the suppliers and trying to optimize that so that you can get to a level which is lower than what you've always bought, and you've always bought a service level because you always thought that's the minimum. But these workshops help uncover a lot of those aha moments where you suddenly realize you were paying for something that's not required, and hence why putting a burden on the cost from a supplier's perspective, and suppliers passing on that cost to you as you go through it. So depending on how disruptive or how aggressive you want to be, there's the lower end, which essentially are on a less sensitive categories like facilities management, or you could go into the highly disruptive, which is more on the software or hardware or some big programs that are running ongoing it. But this approach is very similar, but it requires that rigor, it requires that collaboration with the business to go under the covers on the requirements. So that's essentially the core aspect from a demand-related perspective. There's other things that come out of those workshops, which is around policy tightening. So where the policies on travel and or contractors isn't aligned, and they need to be looked at, or any supplier requests that are last minute or urgent requirements which are not thought through from a specification perspective. How can you intervene into that and optimize those requirements? So those are the demand-related levers. I'll talk to you when I talk through some client examples. I'll bring some of these to life. The second group of levers is essentially around choking demand, and this is the purchasing desk that I mentioned earlier on. And in simplistic terms, what this is essentially establish a gated process. So all the requests from the business coming in to spend money is essentially intervened, and based on the policy and based on a certain criteria, the idea is to either stop that demand, which is not business critical and you don't need to spend the money this year, or you delay it. So if it's not this year, maybe we can move it to next year because you still need to do it, but can you delay it so that it doesn't hit this year's numbers from a EBITDA perspective? Or you rechannel it. So if it's an urgent requirement, it has to be dealt with. Can you make sure you get the best value out of it? And I think this is where you've got mini RFPs or e-auctions that you get into, where you rechannel that demand into your either preferred suppliers, or if you haven't got a preferred supplier, then you try and rechannel it through a buying desk type approach. So that's the second group of levers. The third group of levers is essentially around the supply related. I think this is probably, some of this is quite common for the organizations to do, where they go out for incumbent negotiations on pricing or put a blanket discount, as I mentioned before, across the portfolio of suppliers that you have. Again, I think the success that we've seen come more of is when you are more targeted in your approach on those suppliers. So typically the top 10 suppliers in an organizations, you need to have a very different approach from a value realization perspective or quick benefits delivery perspective versus the rest of the suppliers. So if you look at the top 10 suppliers, for example, in one of the organizations, there's a CXO level conversations that trigger, and they run on a drumbeat. So you've got 2 or 3 sessions, and the idea is that in the first session you lay the objective, and there's a collaborative discussion between the supplier CEO and your CEO, or one level down if that's more appropriate. But essentially the idea is to showcase a long-term collaboration with that supplier, but in return also help a joint exercise a partnership on how we can maximize the value this year. So there's that end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum is where you've got tail suppliers. And we've gone in and done some negotiation factories and driving really quick benefits on some of the less strategic, more transactional suppliers that you've got, with an aim to not only drive benefit, but also consolidate and give more spend to those suppliers so that they get the benefit out of that process as well, rather than just seen as a discount-driven activity. So hopefully that gives you some ideas in terms of the thought process. Essentially, now that you've heard about the different approaches, the different levers, let me just play how we've done this recently. So we had this technology business which was has just recently been through a massive merger of 3 entities across the globe. Large spend, circa about 8,000 suppliers or so, with very limited spend transparency. As part of that merger, there was a commitment to drive the value post-merger, which was around the EBITDA targets. So the global CFO drove a program, and there was an idea on what can we achieve in year 1, and there was a big gap from a savings perspective. Their target was 15% of the entire spend, which was quite substantial. So our team came in, and essentially the approach was for us to start segmenting the 8,000 suppliers. And very quickly, as you break it down by geography, by category, by a business unit, you suddenly realize there's about 20 suppliers or so that dictate the majority of the spend. And those are the suppliers who are engaged very dispersely all across the different geographies. There's no central control. And there was an opportunity for, again, to consolidate those conversations and drive that CXO level engagement with those 20 suppliers, which again went through a rigor, drumbeat, and 3 or 4 discussions over a time period of about 3 to 4 weeks. There was some fairly strong ideas that came out on the table, which not only put some money up front on the table in terms of the prebates and the rebates that the suppliers could offer against some longer term contracts, but also helping out on some specification optimization as we go through it and drive those benefits in a very quick fashion. So this wasn't a sourcing driven activity. This was more around seeing how can we strategically engage those top 10 suppliers. So a lot of that 8 million benefit that was delivered was from those aspects on looking at engaging with the suppliers. The other end of the spectrum was the lower spend suppliers, and these were typically the tail suppliers, which were a majority of that 8,000 suppliers. And the idea there was, how can you drive and consolidate by category by running very fast negotiation factories, which run with a rigor. Essentially, there's a lot of prep involved up front, but those negotiation factories, the idea for that is you bring in certain suppliers in the same location for a certain period of time in a week. And based on those analytic rigor behind and multiple round of discussions, you agree on something which can be implemented straight away as you finish those negotiation factories, so that the benefits are delivered straight away after that. So some of those thoughts, some of the same principles that we talked about earlier in action, and we delivered some tangible benefit out of that, which was much appreciated by the client. The second example that I've got is around a global bank, and this particular bank was essentially has had a lot of problems over the years, and they've struggled in terms of generating the right EBITDA. There's shareholders on what benefit is expected from year 1, and the bank was tracking at a really slow rate in order to achieve the benefit. So there wasn't enough months left of the year, and they had a sizable task to deliver those savings opportunities. So what we ended up doing was essentially do similar to the previous client in terms of engaging the suppliers, but in addition to that, there was a cost control tower that was established, and that cost control tower essentially was intervening right up front before the money is spent to the third-party suppliers with a certain triage or a decision tree and the right process to intervene to stop that demand if possible. If you can't stop it and it's still required, can be delayed, or can we channel it appropriately so that we don't end up going with the same supplier, which the business is saying based on those rates. So the implementation of the cost control tower was pretty quick, and the savings started to rank up over time as the demand was pushed through, or the requests were pushed through the tower. The second key activity that happened within that was the IT category, which as a bank, it's typically one of the biggest spend areas. We started going into the detail of the specifications. Software was one area to focus on. And based on some quick analytics, we identified certain renewals that were coming up, which are not required. So there were licenses that were renewed, which weren't used over the last 6 months or 12 months, and the analysis showed that, which were completely stopped from being renewed. And the licenses that were renewed, there was a challenge back, how many of that need to be a premium license versus a lower tier license, which would be more cost effective. So there's a lot of demand driven activity for the bank did, and the savings were significant, which helped plug a large chunk of the gap that the bank had for that one year. So now that you've heard about what you can expect to achieve, what approaches we've deployed and refined and tried and tested, and some client examples, let me just give you a quick heads up in terms of what do you need to embark this journey, because I've seen clients who have driven programs, but some of these aspects weren't ticked at the very start, and they really struggled over time or in terms of delivering those benefits. Although the approaches were sound, the thinking was sound, the resources were sound, it just didn't stick because of some of these aspects. So there's 5 key aspects which are really important for you to think about when you're starting this journey or at the very early stages of the journey. Number 1, and the most important one, which I've always seen, is the sponsorship, and this needs to be a CXO level sponsorship. So there needs to be typically a CEO or a CFO who's sponsoring this program and who's personally accountable for the outcomes of the program, and who chairs the steering committees, who helps drive unlock the roadblocks that the program will come into, because these are sensitive things that you get into the bank, and there's a lot of escalations, and you just want to make sure you've got the right level of sponsorship. Absolutely essential when you're disrupting within the business with some core ideas to drive these benefits. You have the sponsorship from the top person. Number 2, it's around stakeholder engagement. So it's really important. It's not seen just as a procurement driven activity. It needs to be a joint one team, one target attitude, where you've got not only procurement, although procurement drives a lot of this activity, but you have the business, finance, and the various stakeholders all aligned, and these targets are embedded into their targets as well for the year. So that's one team that's driving this rather than seen as a procurement driven activity. Number 3 then is the technology, and this is really important from a pace perspective, because you can do the same things on an Excel spreadsheet or by spending a lot of time and effort on doing the analysis, but technology just helps run things much faster and provides that real-time MI that you need to make those decisions. So for example, the negotiation factories that I mentioned previously, the technology platform was absolutely critical, because based on the new offers that the suppliers came up with, you could quickly churn through that on a TCO model using the technology eFlow platform and showcase what's the value that the business is going to get by making that decision. Number 3 then is around the delivery approach, and I think some of those aspects I talked through before, but one of the things that's really important here is the in-year savings delivery is very different to a typical sourcing program. So a typical sourcing program, just as a key contrast, would take typically from anywhere from 6 to 9 months by the client to deliver. But here you haven't got that luxury. Every single day that takes on within that program is essentially a day lost, or day savings lost for that year. So your target gets steeper and steeper as every single day marches on. So the idea here is to be very pragmatic, really rapid, and be able to drive those benefits with sound fact-based analytics that's supporting that. And then finally, the benefits tracking and governance. So once we've got all of this together, as these initiatives start delivering a standard way of recording these benefits and making sure these are hitting the P&L as we go through it. So hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that generated some thoughts. If there's any comments, any thoughts, any questions, or if you would like us to have a more focused conversation, please do reach out to us. My details on the screen, and look forward to speaking to you in the near future. Thank you for your time.